Do you realize that every single culture in the world has a flood story? Even some of the regions in the middle of the continent of Africa, which are the furthest from any body of significant water, they still have worldwide flood stories. There's something about this. I personally would argue that's because the story's true. I'm going to begin reading here in Genesis chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, and you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of all the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of birds of the heavens, and male and female each, to keep their offspring alive on the face of the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. It's such a familiar story to us that I don't know that we fully grasp what a terrifying story this is. It may actually be the single most terrifying story in the Bible, the worldwide flood. But how funny is it that when we think of the flood, we often think of it as a children's story, when I would argue that the flood is many things, but it's not a children's story. When my son was born, we had a baby shower, or actually before he was born, we had a baby shower. And we had a theme. The theme was not Noah's Ark. But for some reason, that year, the trendy thing to give to any family with a new baby was to give little things that had to do with Noah's Ark. I'm going to show you a picture right here. It's on your screen of Noah's Ark that someone gave us to put either on their door of their nursery, maybe on the wall above the crib. And you can see that has got to be the cutest, cuddliest Noah's Ark that you could possibly imagine. All the animals look so happy. They almost look like they're having the time of their lives. Of course, they also look really big. And the boat looks pretty small, but they sure look happy about it. I like this one even better, where it looks a little crowded. I don't know that there's room for even an ant. They added maybe even a little butterfly. The whole ship might sink. There are so many creatures on this boat. But what is it about this story that makes us want to tell it to our children? What makes us want to tell it as some sort of a metaphor for a nursery? I think that when we imagine flood stories, we actually get closer if we can imagine it as a worldwide Holocaust. I am especially a fan of something a little bit more like this. Now, that's how I imagine it to be in the ark. When you see something like that with the waves raging and the storm blowing, and you can imagine that there are animals and humans on the inside who are losing their lunch. It looks rough in there. And that's how I would have imagined it. This is even my favorite here, where they look like they are, well, it looks like it would be a little hard to even get a nap when it's that rough. That's probably a little closer to how it was. Now, when I was a boy, I grew up with memory verse scrolls, and many of you did as well, where at the bottom of the page, there would be a memory verse to learn, but the rest of the page would be a picture of the Bible story we were going to talk about. In my mind, That's what that story really looked like. So when I see a film version of the story, or if I see another artist's representation of the story, I think, well, that's fine, but that's not what it looked like. It looked like my memory verse scroll. For example, I remember this one. It's an old Harry Anderson picture of people banging on the door to get back into the ark. This is from the Blue Bible Story book by Uncle Arthur Maxwell. And I remember as a child, this is the closest I got to thinking, that looks terrifying. Somebody please open the door for these people. But you know what? I think there's something healthy about recognizing that the flood story is an absolute tragedy. It's an absolute Holocaust, if you will. Everybody on the planet dies, except for a small little family who spends 120 years building a boat, a very, very large boat, out of gopher wood, and somehow they manage to survive. What happens to them? Well, Genesis gives us only the sparsest of details. I love this picture, by the way. The amazing woodcuts of Gustave Doré are some of the best, not only his depictions of Bible stories, but also his depictions of Dante's Inferno, of Milton's Paradise Lost. Here you see people are just trying to grab hold of the rocks before they are drowned by this flood. And you can see animals dying, and it's terrifying. Now, how does Noah respond to this terrifying event? He survives the flood. His family survives the flood. A lot of animals survive the flood. So how does he respond? Once they finally come out of the ark, how does he respond? Well, he plants a vineyard. He plants a vineyard and he makes wine. And once he's made the wine, he gets drunk. And once he gets drunk, he gets naked. And then once he's naked, his son sees him naked, and so Noah curses his son. And then, despite the fact that Genesis tells us that Noah lives for another 300 years after this, Noah pretty much disappears. We don't know what happens to Noah afterwards. This is fascinating in some ways because there are parallels here to some of the other great stories. And I encourage you to read the entire story of Noah and the flood. Read it with new eyes, recognizing that this is not a children's story. This is a terrifying story. His son gets cursed. Noah is clearly damaged by what has taken place. This is an interesting moment when we see where somebody has obeyed God and despite his obedience has come out of the situation damaged. And that's not an unbiblical idea, that sometimes, even in obedience, that people can come out hurt by it. By that I don't mean lost. I don't mean they come out beyond being fixed, but damaged nonetheless. It's impossible to imagine anybody who went through the experience that Noah's wife, his sons and daughters-in-law, that what they went through, that they would not come out of that ark damaged. And I think that that's an important thing as we read the story, that we recognize that. Here's where I think we get a little bit of a picture of this. 700 years before the Genesis account, there is an account of the flood that I think is so like the Genesis flood that I have to believe it's referring to the exact same flood. 700 years before, in about the year 2000 BC, in the city of Ur. Now, somebody else came out of Ur in about 2000 BC. That would be Abram and Sarai, two pagans that God calls out of Ur into a new promised land. Well, from that group of people that they're leaving, the Mesopotamians, they produced what is called the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic is the oldest known complete literary document. And it's extraordinary, really. It's extraordinary because it gives us a picture of what the people that Abram leaves are like. It tells a story that, well, gives us a hint of Eden. It gives us a hint of why Abram would be very happy to leave Ur and that entire region. But most importantly, it gives us a complete flood story that's not unlike the one that's in Genesis. Now, I would encourage you, if you are interested in reading it, you can find it in almost any library. It's called the Gilgamesh Epic. Easily, Abraham and Sarai would have known this story because it is the dominant story of the region. We have since found thousands of copies of this story all along the Fertile Crescent where Abraham would have traveled. Everywhere Abram went, they were telling the story of Gilgamesh. So what is the story in Gilgamesh? Well, unlike Genesis, where God laments how people have grown wicked, in the Gilgamesh epic, the gods are just tired of how the people have gotten so noisy. They're just making too much noise. And so the gods of the Mesopotamians, the gods of the early Babylonians, if you will, decide we're just going to kill them all with a flood. Except they decide to save one man and his family. Now, this man's name is not Noah, but I would argue that it could be the same figure. His name isn't Noah. His name is, this is a good name. You might want to use this name someday if you're looking for a name to name your son. Utnapishtim. Very catchy, right? Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is a good man. And Utnapishtim is given instructions to build a boat. He's going to build a boat that is 3 decks high, that is made of wood. Now, unlike Noah's Ark, which actually is a seaworthy vessel, Utnapishtim's boat is described as kind of more like a big giant square that would just float but wouldn't be able to maneuver in any way. But he builds this enormous boat. He builds it in only 7 days, which seems a little ridiculous. I think Noah's boat seems a little more practical. Everything about the Noah story seems a little more practical than the Gilgamesh account. But he builds this boat and is saved by a worldwide flood. And then Utnapishtim is granted something that Noah is not granted. He's granted eternal life. He can't die. That's what's in the Gilgamesh epic. But Utnapishtim is not happy. He's damaged by what has happened. He's bitter about what has happened. He's angry that the world that he once knew, the people he once knew, they're all gone. They're all dead. So he goes up into the mountains and he lives the rest of his life. And apparently he's still there since he can't die. He lives as a hermit and he doesn't want to see people. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even like people. because he's really upset about what has occurred. Now, I'm not in any way arguing that the Gilgamesh epic is an accurate account. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. I think, if anything, this really will help you have faith in the Genesis account, which will show you that the account of Noah, the one that's in Genesis, is so much more of a realistic account of what could happen as opposed to the one that happens to Utnapishtim. But here's a fascinating part that is intriguing to me. There are enough similarities to make us realize that they're telling at least parts of the same story. Both Utnapishtim and Noah build a 3-story boat. They're both saved from a worldwide flood. They both send out 3 birds. And when they land, they both have a rainbow. And the rainbow is a promise that God will not destroy the world in this way anymore. That seems a little too uncanny. They must at least be referring to the same story. But another way that they're very similar is that they are both damaged. Noah and Utnapishtim both seem to be hurt by what has taken place. In the Gilgamesh epic, if I could just tell a little bit of the story, Gilgamesh, the figure of Gilgamesh, is very depressed. And he wants to know, how is it that he could live forever? Well, he realizes that there's a hermit that lives somewhere up in the mountains named Utnapishtim, who has been granted eternal life. So he makes the long trek to go find Utnapishtim. So he works his way there, and he actually finally finds his way to see Utnapishtim, but Utnapishtim won't see him. Utnapishtim says, "Go away, I don't want to see anybody." But it's actually Utnapishtim's wife that says, "Come on, Ut. This guy has come all this way to see you. Can you at least hear what he has to say?" So begrudgingly, Utnapishtim agrees to hear him. And Gilgamesh explains that he's seeking the secret of everlasting life. And Utnapishtim's response is fascinating. And I'm going to actually read from it. Here is actually a quote from Gilgamesh, and this is from the Michael Hamburger translation. Now he's talking to Gilgamesh, and he says this. This is an old man now. He says, "Life is not the thing I thought it was. Even in its brevity, in its sorrow, it's all sorrow. All sorrow. Death is a friend, though fear of it rips the ear like a hurt hound. Why would you seek eternity of such noise?" Here we have Utnapishtim, who sounds incredibly, well, you know what he sounds like? He sounds like a man who's experiencing PTSD. Now, I spent some time chatting with some individuals who have worked with individuals who have PTSD, and I've also chatted with those who have struggled with PTSD. And they have noticed that the response of Noah in his reaction to his son, in his quick cursing of his son, but also the response of Utnapishtim here looks an awful lot like PTSD. Now, is it such a hard thing for us to imagine that in a story as traumatic as the flood, a worldwide flood, a flood that annihilates the population of a planet, and not just the human population, but the animal population, that annihilates even some of the, if not most of the plant life? Well, is it so hard to imagine that this would cause a response in Noah, that he might actually have PTSD? Is it possible that even Noah, who was completely obedient in everything he did, that he comes out of it damaged? I don't think that's inconsistent at all with Scripture, because God has never promised that obedience will give you everything you want and a nice sofa chair to go with it. No. As a matter of fact, following God sometimes will require your life. It might require great pain. Might it even require some mental strain? You see, this isn't a kid's story. When we read the story as it is, this isn't a kid's story. So read the story of Noah again. No longer thinking of it as this beautiful story for little children. And I totally understand why we love this story for children. The reason why we have beautiful depictions of animals in Noah's Ark for little children is it's really saying something beautiful. And that is that outside of this home, outside of this nursery, the world is dangerous. Outside of here, the world is terrifying. But here it's safe. Here you're taken care of. Well, that's beautiful. And that really is the message our children, I hope, get from Noah's Ark. But those of us who aren't children anymore, I think we're ready to hear what the author of Genesis truly is trying to say. And what the account, which I believe is a true story, is saying. And that is that this is a terrifying moment in the world's history. And we have much to be grateful for that Noah's family, that they were obedient, and it cost them a great deal. And I think that that's true of so many stories. Now, by the way, why is it that the story of Utnapishtim would have him live on forever? Well, I think I've got a good response to that. Think about this for a moment. After the flood, people no longer live 800-900 years like they do before the flood, but Noah does. Noah still has the long life of the antediluvian world, and he lives for another 300 plus years. So it's not so hard for me to imagine that the people in those last days of Noah would hear stories about the hermit who lives up in the mountains, who seems to live on and on and on. And that might even generate stories of, well, it almost seems like he's living forever. Maybe. These are amazing stories, and we need to read them oftentimes as they're meant to be read, as extraordinary accounts of hard things. Thank you so much.